It's my pleasure to have David Earwick here from UC Davis, currently actually at Sealy Lake. Um, and we trust that his connection will hold up through this presentation. Um, his topic, which he's about to tell you about the um, asymmetrical expectations about faculty in relation to the master plan, he has just recently submitted for his PhD. So I think I will just turn it over to David. Yes, exactly, Bill. 3 cheers for everyone who finishes. Um, so if you'd like to go ahead, David.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much, Ann. And thanks to all of you for taking time on your Friday afternoon. As Ann said, I just recently submitted this dissertation at UC Davis in the School of Education. And I'm beginning the transition from this rather large, cumbersome, pre-formatted document, if you will, into pieces that are, I think, a little bit more readable, more carefully summarized, and I think a little bit more consumer friendly. But I'm only beginning that process. There's a certain amount of time I had to take off afterwards just to relocate what was left of my my meditative processes, I think. So what I'm hoping is that once I introduce the topic and go over a number of the points that I pursued and discovered during the course of this research, that questions will come up. It's a very interesting topic for me. I think it's of interest to a lot of the other folks connected to CSHE, and I'm hoping that you have some ideas of your own about the currency of the master plan with regard to the CSUs and the UCs and research functions. And so we'll get into more of that in the not too distant future here, but just with that as a caveat, I am, let me just go over to the next slide here. So asymmetric expectations. This is a topic that came to me as a result of having spent 25 years working in the CSU system, 12 years at San Diego State, where I served as the managing director of the Center for International Business Education and Research, and then 13 years at Sacramento State, where I served in my last position as Associate VP for Research Affairs and Chief Research Officer. So between those two campuses, I had quite a bit of exposure to the CSU, to its faculty. I served on a number of system-wide committees for the Chancellor's Office and was frequently down at the Chancellor's Office working with them. And so I got an inside view as well as a campus view as to how the system worked and didn't work, and the way that faculty were situated in terms of the research and scholarly enterprise. So let me see here. So what I'd like to do is just cover these points briefly. I'll talk briefly about myself. I'll go briefly into the master plan and how it came about. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but I learned a great deal as a result of my sort of tortured process pursuing the doctorate. And this issue of differentiation of function, what that means, how it comes to play and impact the roles of research for CSU faculty. And I do want to make clear that the focus of the research is the CSU. It's the CSU faculty in particular, and the master plan context and how it impacts the CSU. It's not about the University of California system. I'm a product of the UC system, both undergraduate and graduate, and certainly a happy alum of UC Davis. So I've seen what excellence exists at the UCs. But again, this emphasis is on the CSU system and the CSU's faculty. I'll touch briefly on the research questions that I used to approach the dissertation. Very briefly, I'll cover the methodologies that I followed and the process of data analysis. There were 3 major areas that I'll touch on. And then I'll get slightly more into the nitty gritty on some of the steps that I followed and why and how this was all impacted by COVID. Because a major chunk of the data gathering in terms of the expert interviews and the faculty surveys that I did took place last spring when the pandemic and many of the campuses' responses to the pandemic were in full swing. Most everyone I dealt with was working from home at both the UCs and the CSU campuses. And many of the experts that I interviewed around the world were also working from home. So, and then a brief summary of the outcomes that I discovered, the lessons learned, and some next steps for this. This is, it's a dissertation. Most, if not all of you have done dissertations. And this movement from the rather large tome into a series of papers and products that are more focused and more honed is the process that I'm beginning on. And that process will take at least 6 to 9 months, if not longer. And that's what I'm organizing during the course of this summer. So, so what I have on this slide here, let me back up here and just go one step at a time here. And working on technology at a small cabin in Montana is a bit of a challenge. They don't have cable, or the internet is via DSL. So, so I mentioned that that I worked very closely with 2 CSU campuses. The other thing I wanted to point out was that faculty development was always a big part of what I worked on. At San Diego State, it was the international side. And at Sacramento State, it was, in terms of the research enterprise, working with faculty on skill development, research agenda development, and things that were completely centered around faculty and their research agendas. Now, the point of that is that there's every opportunity for an injection of researcher bias into the work that I did. I was very careful in terms of having things double and triple checked. Every instrument that I utilized was reviewed by 2 different bodies of both faculty and off-campus folks. But I cannot extricate myself from the fact that I spent 25 years in the CSU. I purposely did not interview anyone at the chancellor's office or any senior campus administrators from within the CSU for 2 reasons. One, because I had a very good sense of how the system worked. And number 2, this was about the faculty and about the master plan. And to start getting involved in the CSU systemic responses would have been an entirely different topic. So, so I separated those out. And I also talked about COVID, and it did have an impact. The interviewees, the experts, were sitting at home in their home offices with their entire academic lives substantially disrupted. The faculty that I surveyed, we're all working from home. There were pretty serious discussions about the financial impact on the campuses. And for faculty, that means very, very scarce resources that might support a scholarly agenda might be even more limited. And their teaching assignments might be impacted as a result of this. Not to mention the fact that they were all teaching online very, very suddenly. So it was in that context that I was asking them questions about their perspectives, either on the master plan or on their research and scholarly agendas, and how they fit within the context of their professional agendas. And so I'm sure that that had an impact on the quality of the data and the kinds of answers that I was getting, but I don't have any mechanism for determining that. I'd like to do some longitudinal work on this, but I'll get to that later on in terms of next steps. So with that as my caveat, most of you who know the master plan are familiar with the fact that the CSUs have a different assignment, if you will, than the UCs. The language specifically says that the faculty research is authorized to the extent that it's consistent with the primary function of the state colleges and the facilities provided for that function. In other words, if it's related to the instructional process and the instructional mission, then they are authorized to pursue it. Now, if you contrast that with the UC system, the UC is the primary state-supported academic agency for research. So you have the primacy of the University of California in terms of research, and it is also state-supported. There's nothing in the language that references support for or fiscal support for any faculty research and scholarly activity at the CSUs. Now, this was 1959, 1960. If you go back then, you had Pat Brown, who was a very new governor, and you had Clark Kerr, who was very new president of the University of California system. And they were looking for a compromise. They were looking to sign a treaty, if you will. There were 9 CSU campuses back then. They were state colleges back then, teachers' colleges, normal schools. And they had managed to grab the ear of a lot of state legislators who discovered that it was really good for their reelection chances and for their district if they could manage to get a state college put into their districts. So Kerr could see that there were a number of state colleges that were potentially looming on the horizon. And at the time the negotiations for the master plan were going on, in addition to the 9, there were 3 and potentially 4 more waiting for approval. And Kerr could see that the very precious resources for the state of California for public higher education could easily be diverted away from the University of California system and threaten the excellence and the plans that he had in place. And Pat Brown needed an agreement that would constitute a solid working plan for all the students who were in the pipeline after World War II. The first round of the baby boomers were having children. And he needed it to be a fairly fixed financing process so that he could attend to the other demands on the state's budget. So this language that you see in front of you was a compromise. It was a treaty. The process by which it was negotiated could be another dissertation in and of itself. And I almost went in that direction at one point because it's fascinating. And Kerr was a magician. There's just no 2 ways about it in terms of the negotiation processes that he followed. So for many years, this language here has been in place, and it is largely still in place. I'll touch briefly on a slight update that took place in 1999. But for the CSU faculty, research is authorized to the extent that it's consistent with the primary functions, which are instructional. And that also applies to facilities. There are no state-supported research facilities for the CSU campuses. It has to be instructionally related. So individual faculty labs, if they exist, they are in privately funded facilities, often funded through the campus research foundations or other auxiliary organizations. So as I mentioned, 25 years at 2 CSU campuses. I did not interview or survey any of the CSU administrators. And then I bring into this process my own perspective on organizations and systems, if you will, and the way these organizations and systems interact in society and also in the higher education and K-12 education ecosystems. So this is excised. This piece that you're seeing in front of you is excised from the dissertation itself. And I felt that it was important that I lay out what my biases were in approaching this, both as a filtering device and as a translational device. I stayed very mindful of this and my own biases as I navigated the coding and the analytical processes that followed in the dissertation. But this is something that, having been within the system for 25 years, was important for me to state and to be clear about in terms of my perspective. So I as most of you know, the identification of a research question or questions is in some ways the hardest part of a dissertation. And it took me a long time to narrow these down such that I could then use the tools and find the data and analyze the data to answer these particular questions. So the first one is the language still relevant and appropriate for California, and are there gaps between the policy and the practice that undermine its relevance? And I'm specifically talking again about the differentiation of function regarding research roles for the CSU. And then the second thing is to narrow it down. We talk about policy and practice. The first question is really about policy, and the second is, how does it impact the constituents, the primary constituents that are most immediately affected by this language? And that's the faculty. How do they see research and scholarly activity? I asked them, I'll get into it a little bit later, but I asked them a number of questions about how aware were they of the language? Did they think it was relevant to them? Did they think it was relevant to their colleagues? How closely did their own research and scholarly agendas align with the language? And then, inevitably I asked them questions about whether they thought it should be changed. But there's a substantial amount of data that I touched on into my dissertation, but I didn't include in it because I developed so much, because I've been working on this topic for a considerable amount of time. So, and just briefly, you can see that the CSU campuses here and their founding dates. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 were in place already. And then 2 more had just been added. 3 more had just been added. And in terms of the dates when the master plan was being finalized, these are the authorization dates and not necessarily the dates that the campus is physically opened. But then you had 3 more here that were in the approval process. So these, again, the startup of a campus is a very expensive process, even back in those days. And Clark Kerr could see this coming, and he could see the potential impact it would have on the UC system. And you had the University of California systems. UC San Diego was just coming online in 1960 when the master plan was translated into law. But Irvine was still 5 years away, and so was Santa Cruz. And then it was another 40 years before Merced was to come along. So growth was a different kind of issue for the UCs versus the CSUs. For the CSUs, the state colleges, they became the CSUs in 1982. Theirs was a lateral growth pattern, whereas for the UCs, it was building in place and building excellence in place. So the infrastructure was already there for the UC system. So, and here is, I don't have too many wordy slides, but this one I thought I would put in. There was a 1967 report to the state of California, and the author of the report, Jocelyn, had noted that immediately after the passage of the Donahoe Act, that the tensions were already there, and amongst the faculty. Part of this goes back to the negotiation process that led to the master plan. But it was clear in a variety of reports that I had read through my research that the faculty identity and the faculty research role was unclear. It was ambiguous, and there were a lot of conflicting intentions at the systemic level, at the presidential level, and at the dean level about what research was required and what roles that it was to take in terms of faculty evaluation and promotion. In the CSU system, it's called RTP, retention, tenure, and promotion. So that is just a short snapshot. There's a lot more out there that touches on this, and I've covered a lot of it in the dissertation. The one, aside from the doctoral programs, the professional doctorates, which we can get into later, the only real change in the language since 1960 related to the research mission was in 1999. It was the addition of or expansion of research, scholarship, and creative activity, still tied to the instructional mission. And that research, scholarship, and creative activity language was meant to satisfy parts of the California Faculty Association, the union for all the full-time faculty and the part-time faculty. But it was also taking into account the fact that the arts and humanities had taken on a much larger role on many of the CSU campuses as compared to 1960. And so the breadth and interpretation of what scholarship would look like and research would look like was expanded considerably there. And this again does tie into how faculty are evaluated, which is captured in the collective bargaining process for the faculty. There are 23,000 full-time and part-time faculty across the CSU system, all represented by one union, the California Faculty Association. So there were three primary phases of this work. The first was archival work, background work. The Bancroft Library at Berkeley has some extensive and considerable resources related to the master plan and its negotiations and development. And so I used time there to go over meeting minutes and memos and a lot of correspondence about the master plan and its the strategic priorities and how people saw the CSU or the state college faculty. The CSU Chancellor's Office, their archives are on the campus of CSU Dominguez Hills in Carson. And so I made a number of visits there to review materials, especially not only meeting minutes and things like that, but there are a lot of oral histories there that are unpublished but available for reading. And you can get quite an informed sense of the internal dynamics, the internal questions that were going on when the CSU or the state college team was doing its negotiations and how to prioritize research. And a lot of the infighting that was going on between the different campus presidents. And then the Arthur Kuntz was president of Occidental College, and he was the chair of the Master Plan Commission that created the master plan and helped translate it into language. And his presidential archives are fairly detailed in terms of his perspectives as the president of a private university, watching the state colleges and the UCs do their battle, along with Roy Simpson, who was the state superintendent of public instruction back then. So each of these archives, as well as some others, law libraries for specifics on legislative processes, and the California State Library in downtown Sacramento all had materials that I was able to access. Although largely that disappeared once COVID hit. And that was one of the complications, is that you just could not get into any of these places. But the bulk of my work had been done prior to. The second component of my research process was to interview a set of policy experts, higher education policy, systems, and finance experts on the current status of the master plan. Again, focusing in on the research language, the differentiation of function language. And the discussions were on what had changed. Is the language still relevant? And if it needed to be changed, what parts of it could be changed or should be changed? One of the side conversations ended up also being why has it stayed the same or virtually the same for 60 years? And in the policy section of the dissertation, I get into, in the literature review, I get into some of the public policy rationales for why that is and why it makes sense. And many of those things were echoed by the interviewees. And the final component of this was the faculty survey. And I'll go into some detail on that, but I surveyed via a Qualtrics web-based survey over 600 faculty primarily full-time, tenured and tenure track. If during the survey, if you identified as an instructor or lecturer, you were sort of moved off to the side and thanked for your help, and your responses weren't recorded. There were some emeritus faculty and some faculty going through the early retirement program that responded, but they were not technically full-time faculty at that point. But those faculty in particular had the longest tenures at the CSU, and their perspectives I thought would be helpful. So I made sure that they stayed included. So it's almost exclusively full-time faculty. And let's see here. There were a number of things that I found, and I'll just touch on some of the interesting things that I discovered during the course of my research. Yeah, we're all familiar with the degrees of change in the state of California in nearly every sector since 1960. And one of the things that's changing is the nature of the legislature and the makeup of the legislature, not just term limits as well. So I'd recalled that the Wall Street Journal had done a report in 2011 listing the top 10 institutions in providing degrees for legislators in California. And so I went back and looked at that list and then scanned all the current websites of the current legislatures and came up with this data as well. And so you can see that the institutions are changing. And in 2011, there weren't nearly as many state schools represented in the legislature, but increasingly they are represented. And it's possible that will come in the future to have an impact on the legislative process, on the education committees in the Senate and the Assembly. But it was an interesting data point that I think could also be an issue for some additional research, and it may turn out to be an additional paper that I do. But that is just one data point there. And I apologize, my slides did not translate particularly clearly here. What I intended was to show the changing nature of enrollments for the CSU and the UC. One of the things that I wanted to show, it's hard to see, but if you're looking up here between fall of 1999 and fall of 2018, the undergraduate enrollment at the CSUs went from 285,000 to 428,000. But more importantly, it went to 89% of the total overall enrollment from 79%. What you're seeing is at the CSUs, you're seeing an increased emphasis on undergraduate. That's the targets that the state is pushing. Those are the targets that the state is funding. And so that's the direction that the ship of state at the CSU is starting to realign itself. That can be said, I believe, to have implications, long-term implications for the research agendas. It's difficult to have a robust research agenda as a faculty member if you don't have access to graduate students. And as you can see, the overall graduate population has declined at the CSU system, whereas across this, it's been absolutely steady state for the UC systems. They retain their strength in that area. And again, that's just a data point that I've included in the dissertation that tends to highlight some of the changes that are going on. This is backed up by, and again, I apologize for the nature of the slide here, but another change that's happening is that if you talk about the tripartite mission of teaching, research, and service that are part of a comprehensive university or a public research university, when hard choices need to be made, where do those things start to get reflected? And one of the things that I'm seeing is that instruction is staying relatively constant at the master's and the research levels. But you see this drop in public service at the master's or the regional comprehensives and at the primarily undergraduate institutions, and it's certainly at the community colleges as well. So what this suggests is that there's an element of a zero-sum game going on, and if choices are being made about research and instruction and service, Service seems to be losing out in terms of budget support, which will then translate into faculty activity. So again, these are in some ways peripheral points, but they're important points that are starting to impact the nature of the changes that are going on. So the expert interviews, I made 16 requests. I prioritized experts. I used their H-index scores, citation numbers, and also the direct relevance of their publications. Some were inside the US, some were outside the US, some were in California, some were outside California, some at private institutions, some at public institutions. So I had a good mix, again, from policy, systems, and finance. And I made 16 requests, and half of them said yes. For some of them, there was just no time because of the pandemic, and some I just didn't get responses from. But I did eight formal surveys, some via Zoom. 2 were via Skype. And one was, let's see, yes. And then one was using a campus-based proprietary video system that they have set up. It was not one that I'd encountered before, but it went smoothly. The shortest one was half an hour, and the longest was over an hour. I should point out that all of this was reviewed and approved by the UC Davis IRB. The questions, the consent forms, every aspect of it had been reviewed by the IRB well in advance, both for the interviews and for the surveys. And I did the interviews over a 10-day period, making detailed notes on the side as I was engaging in the interviews. And then I used a firm outside the US for privacy purposes. I used a firm outside the US for the electronic transcription, the machine transcription of the interviews, and then proceeded to edit and analyze them. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, just briefly, this is some text that I did pull from the dissertation. I used a really comprehensive constant comparative method. Because of the huge volume of data I'd gotten from the expert interview text, there were several open-ended questions on the survey, which allowed faculty to go into greater detail about their perspectives regarding scholarship. And then an enormous amount of data that I had from the archival work. And I used NVivo as a platform for organizing all of that. That was very effective. And I followed a very structured coding and analysis program in order to start to translate this enormous amount of text into some workable data. So I could then start narrowing down the themes and really start to make some defensible conclusions about what I was seeing and what I was gathering. So in terms of the expert interviews, there's a lot that I can say, far more that I can cover in our time today. But uniformly, there was a great deal of affection for Clark Kerr and the enormity and the impact of his work. I've put in there intellectually robust, Platonic figure and a philosopher king. Those are all quotes from different interviewees. Some of them had actually worked with Kerr, either at Carnegie after he'd left the UC, or when he was later on in either emeritus or retired status. They had worked with him in different commissions. He had written forewords for things. He'd just worked with them in different ways. So a lot of them actually had direct interactions with Kerr. And so they knew his intent with the master plan. They knew what he wanted to accomplish and why. And I'm sure that informed how they looked at him and how they looked at the master plan. But they were also very, very clear about the fact that it's 60 years old and it desperately needs a tune-up here. So, and I've just put a couple of little quotes here and there that I wanted to share. And again, I have from those 8 interviews, it turned out to be 300 pages of transcript text alone, just from those. So it's very quite a mountain of data that I'm working with here. So so the questions that were posed to them had to do with, should the language related to differentiation of function, again, the specific language about the research role for the CSU and the faculty, should that be changed? Should it be modified? Was it still relevant for today? And uniformly, there was agreement that the policy was outdated. But there was not uniformity in terms of how that should be addressed. And there were some surprising things. There were several of these experts argued that it was time for the CSUs to start to work on a PhD program, that a PhD would make sense for several of the CSUs, that there would be trade-offs, but it would make sense for them. That's not something I've ever argued for, and I don't believe I would argue for it, but there were some folks who were really pushing the envelope on that. Others thought it was a terrible idea, that the PhD business is not what the CSUs are about. They're not equipped for it. They're not funded for it. And that was too much of a step away from the integrity of the master plan and the ethos of the master plan and what it was meant to be as a tripartite structure for the state of California. They find that a lot of things are still working in terms of the CSUs. But there was recognition that the faculty at the CSU are much more engaged in research than the 1960 document could possibly have envisioned. And so that's why I believe their general support for revisiting the language of the master plan and the differentiation of function came across pretty clearly. So let's see here. And leading into that, they talked about how unique Clark Kerr was as a leader, and the absolute lack of that kind of macro transformative leadership and personality in terms of why the master plan has not changed very much. There are lots of political reasons why this particular section has not evolved, but one part of it is really that there's been a lack of leadership. The master plan is seen as too sacrosanct to touch. If you start to pull on one thread, then the entire garment may disappear. And politics in California is a bit of a dynamic sport, and if you don't have all of your ducks lined up in terms of any sort of public policy change or direction, you might not really get a sense of what might happen, and the risk for that is too great. And I'm paraphrasing some of the conclusions that I was getting from the experts. But if you don't have a forceful personality, then you're not going to see that level of change on something so large and so substantial. And the other point is that the master plan is largely working for the UC system. And so if there is to be any sort of agitation, it will largely come from the CSU in terms of this particular issue. And the CSU has been largely unwilling to take that on. They've come at it in an indirect way with the professional doctorates, but it's not something that has proven to be a substantial change. And the experts were, I think, uniformly in agreement on that there may be some potential to refocus a little bit more on joint doctorates, but it's not something that either the CSU or the UC seems interested at this point in really pursuing in terms of, in the context of more joint doctorates. It wasn't a particularly popular thing at the outset. So now I talk a lot in the dissertation about mission creep and changing in missions, and it's a fairly substantial topic. You could do, again, there have been entire dissertations just written on the issues of mission change and mission creep, and the whole concept of isomorphic behaviors amongst organizations. what most of the experts see is that the CSUs are evolving naturally, that these kinds of isomorphic activities that are happening are directly relevant to 60 years of change, and the changing nature, the public-private partnership, the nature of the social compact that the master plan was built upon has long disappeared in terms of public support and public finance. And so what's left is allowing the CSU some degree of movement, and they've done that with the independent doctorates, the professional doctorates. And so there are slight changes in the collective bargaining agreement to allow for greater support for faculty research and scholarship, but it's certainly not backed up in terms of dollars at the state level, in terms of sponsored agreements or the kinds of research resources that the CSU has in comparison to the UC. The monies that the CSU gets for research centrally pale in comparison to the UCs. So, but this, I thought that this quote from one of the interviewees about the CSUs, and because we had some conversations about what was the driver of change in terms of elevating the research role at the CSUs. Is it the broader faculty community? Is it the nature of the academy? Or is it deans and provosts who are looking to raise more philanthropic money and raise more grant and contract money? In order to do that, you have to raise your profile of your faculty and your institution and your research numbers. And so this particular individual felt that the locus of those kinds of changes rested solely with the presidents and policymakers, and he was very clear about what he thought needed to happen with that. So let's see here. Let me briefly move on here. Our time is 1:47. Okay. There were a number of the experts who had very clear senses of what was actually going on campuses, over the CSU campuses. And this one particular individual was very clear about their sense of research capacities, and they were very realistic about what's happening and what's not happening in terms of the way the faculty are being supported and what's motivating them individually. If you look back, and it's only anecdotal information I was able to gather, but if you look back 10 or 15 years ago, you were not seeing in job placement ads an emphasis on research for CSU faculty posts. But if you look now, there is a much greater emphasis on a research and scholarly track record and the kinds of expectations that the committee and the institution will have for new hires, even at the assistant professor level. So, so then very quickly, I went on to this faculty survey. I tried to be as systematic as possible in how I approach this. Like I said, I used a Qualtrics-based platform. I analyzed it using NVivo. I focused on 13 campuses using different criteria. I needed to respect the anonymity of my respondents. And so the exact formulas that I used for how I chose different departments and different campuses are not something I can go into. But I tried to get a fairly dispersed set of perspectives across four areas: natural sciences, social sciences, engineering, and arts and humanities. These are all departments that were represented on each of the campuses. I started out with 16, and then as I was compiling the emails, pulling them from all the public campus sites, there was enough differentiation between chemistry and biology that many of the campuses had biochemistry. So I added a 17th department whenever I could in order to capture those who didn't fall directly into either biology or chemistry. Those tended to be larger institutions, but not always. So The survey was launched in April of 2020, again, right in the midst of the earliest and hardest phases of COVID. There were 2 reminders sent out of the 3,271 good email addresses that I had. 602 faculty completed the whole survey. And it was a long survey. It definitely was a long survey. Even with a fairly clear language about anonymity and the way the data would be used, the fact that I was the only person who would see it or use it, it would never be stored on a CSU platform of any sense. There were still a number of faculty who wrote to me and said, I'm just not comfortable doing this. Sometimes I was able to persuade them to think about it again, and sometimes they just were very clear. And I also got that specifically from faculty of color who were concerned about being targeted in terms of the nature of their responses. Also, there were some gender issues that came up as well. So one of the questions that was included in the IRB submission documents and included in the survey was asking them at the end, would they be interested in a follow-up survey on the same basic issue? And 221 out of the 600 said they would be interested in doing a follow-up survey. So that, or a follow-up interview. So that's one of the next steps for me, is to go about identifying some funding and developing the interview protocols so that I can get much more in depth into into how those CSU faculty see and approach research and scholarship in the context of their own particular departments. Because what I found and what the data suggested is that there are department cultures, college cultures, and campus cultures, and they're not all the same. The sort of locus of control that faculty felt and exhibited differed greatly depending upon whether we were talking about department, college, or the campus. And many of the questions I used a 1 through 7 scale, a semantic differential scale, ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree, to try to tease out their as precise an affiliation with a particular answer as I could, given the nature of what I was asking about. So I'll just touch briefly on this. There were 7 different question blocks. You can see how they flowed. And again, you can see the enormity of the questions. And I had another probably 70 or 80 questions teed up that I could have potentially asked, but respondent fatigue would have been terrible. But the completion rate was 88%. So the faculty who started the survey, 88% completed it, which suggested that once they got into the survey, their interest in the topic and their interest in completing it was fairly strong. And just and again, I apologize for the way this thing comes out here. I did a fair amount of statistical analysis. Not all of it made it into the dissertation. This is an example of a crosstab between age and gender. I thought this one was particularly helpful because you could see the distribution across the age ranges. I didn't ask specific ages, just ask them to identify a range, and the gender. So this could be used later on for some time series analysis and some other things in order to look at how things are changing over time, and also do comparisons between full professors and incoming professors in terms of some of their perspectives. But as I mentioned in the dissertation, I do need to be careful that I don't further exacerbate any existing gender or other kinds of biases that exist currently on campuses. The CSUs have quite a few issues related to those right now. Here's another example of a chart that I pulled. Part of what I wanted to know was when was their doctorate issued. I'm able to, the vast majority of them also indicated their doctoral institution. And so another side project that I want to look at is how did they, is to pull their doctoral institution and the year that they earned their doctorate, and how was that institution ranked in terms of whether it's AAU or the US News and World Report rankings or things like that. These are very subjective proxies, but there's some value in looking at that and then assessing based on the ranking of their doctoral institution, how are they seeing their own research and scholarly identities, and to see is it possible that those that are coming from higher ranking doctoral institutions, are they more predisposed or less predisposed, or the data is mixed in terms of interested in pursuing research? Again, that's another side project. This is, as you can see here, I asked them to identify where they earned their doctorates, and the UCs were obviously the highest generator. Out of the 600, 230 had gotten their doctorate from a UC campus of one sort or another. So to the extent that you have the most powerful and prestigious set of public research universities in the land generating the faculty at the CSUs, there's a direct correlation between research cultures that they're coming from and what they're attempting to replicate, and also creating some tension on their home CSU campuses. Very different job functions, but the origin of the faculty is important. The dissertation has a lot more detail, and there are also a number of fairly substantial international institutions and a lot from Canada. And very quickly, I'll go over the distribution of individuals by departments. Again, between the sciences, the natural sciences, social sciences, arts and humanities, and engineering. This is how it ended up working out. And my logic in terms of the biochemistry did not pan out. In the end, it would have been better to have just looked at their individual profiles and assigned them to either biology or chemistry. But that's one of the lessons learned from this process here. And then very quickly, there was one of the questions that I asked them, and this is copied directly from the dissertation. Master plan language on research roles for the CSU is still relevant to me as a current CSU faculty member. And if you look at this, that's over 50% found that it was still, or articulated that it was still somewhat relevant to them as faculty. And all 600 answered that question. Now, following up two questions later, they were asked to identify and answer, my research is consistent with the instructional mission language of the master plan. You had a very different dispersal here. When you start to localize this to their particular individual research agendas. And there are statistics and charts and histograms and other things in the dissertation that go into more detail on this. So I'm just giving you a quick sample of some of the things that are out there. So my time is going to run short here, and I would like to move to some questions and comments. So there's a couple of things that I found very interesting. Going back to the archival work that I did, one of the things that I discovered is that there was an interesting potential conflict of interest that was not discussed in any of the materials that I saw. But I noticed that Clark Kerr had 3 regents during the time that the master plan was being negotiated. Clark Kerr had 3 regents who also served on the board of Occidental College, which meant that he had 3 regents that were fairly close to him as the president of the University of California, who were also overseeing the president of Occidental, who was the chair of the master plan committee. Now, one of those regents was Dorothy Chandler, who was among the most powerful and wealthy women in the state of California. So it's not something I found discussed anywhere, but I got the board of directors roles from Occidental, and you can pull up from the UC OP site, all the regions back then, and you can find these matches. And I looked for correspondence in in Bancroft and some other things, but that was one of the follow-up things that I would have done if the archives had been open. But I thought it was an interesting thing that certainly would have come to light today, and people would have figured it out today, but this was not discussed back then. But overall, let me just try to tie together the consensus from the experts was that the master plan language on differentiation of function was out of date. It is out of date. It does need to change, but there was not agreement on the degree of change, who might lead that change, and what the change might look like. And almost, again, uniformly, they all talked about the very pragmatic aspects of finance. If you make a substantive change of any sort, there will be a financial cost. And since Prop 13, the state of California is distinctly less interested in investing in public higher education. It is increasingly a private good as opposed to a public good, with all the implications that are associated with that. So it may be that the master plan will stay in its current state, and this language will stay this way for a while, barring the unforeseen. And then a final note about the faculty at the CSUs. While there was some mixed messaging in terms of the policy language and what it meant to them individually and in terms of their colleagues, there was a very strong sense that coming from the data that they respected what the UC did. They respected, I think, because almost a third of them had come from the UC system, or more than a third had come from the UC system. They respected the power and prestige of the UC within the master plan, and they were not advocating vociferously for any substantial change. Not a single faculty member mentioned a PhD program, for example. That came from other sources. What they're looking for is sort of a modernization of the language that reflects who they are as faculty, the context in which they navigate themselves as scholars and as professionals within the CSU system. And simply a recognition in some of the workload tabulations and the retention, tenure, and promotion tabulations that research is important. Research informs their pedagogy. And faculty these days are much more involved in research than perhaps they would have been 60 years ago. So my intent with the overall pursuit of the dissertation was to perhaps initiate a conversation. That would, people ask me what I wanted to see out of this. And I thought if we could start a conversation, because the literature out there is fairly innocent of conversations about the CSU faculty role in research and scholarship. And having watched it as someone who was an insider, if you will, as an administrator at 2 CSU campuses, I saw the dichotomies that existed between how people were being evaluated and what they were being asked to perform, and the resources they were getting in order to do that. And then there was a sense of being caught in the middle. And so that's the asymmetry that I talked about in the title a little bit. So that's a very long-winded and comprehensive snapshot of the dissertation that I did. There's a lot of work to do still, and I have all kinds of book ideas and paper ideas that will stem from this. But I'll go ahead and conclude my comments here and then ask you as folks who are on this call about your perspectives on the master plan, this differentiation of function language. Should the status quo remain? Should it be tweaked? If so, how should it be tweaked, and who might launch that? There is a master plan select committee, but they're looking at other things. For example, over the last few years, they're mainly focused on the transfer function, and that's a good thing to focus on. But I've been in touch with the chair and with the committee staffers, and this is not on their agenda. It's not a priority for them. It's not something they've discussed in the past, and if I don't keep bringing it up for them, I don't think they'll discuss it in the future either. So, all right, that concludes my remarks, and I would love to take questions or anything else that you have.
Well, thank you so very much, David. I found that really a fascinating discussion and very much appreciate the the clear way in which you laid out not just your research, but your research methodology.
Thank you.
Everything was very clear.